now you see this real period of sort of flexibility and exploration, usually across the 20s, sometimes into the early 30s, where people are supposed to be kind of on these journeys of self-discovery, career building, the sort of philosophical and existential stuff of figuring out who you are. So this idea of emerging adulthood kind of sees the process of moving from young person to adult as a fairly open-ended one.
The game I play is a very interesting one. It's imagination in a tight straitjacket.
Because by looking at the stars, we are literally looking back through time.
And as the world gets smaller and more connected, the narrative of freedom is rubbing off on people of different cultures and religions, however remote.
You can't get anywhere if you just copy what somebody told you. You have to be challenging things all the time, challenging everything, and thinking new thoughts and so on.
Welcome to another episode of BLab Codes. Today we have Shanthi Robertson from the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University. Welcome, Shanthi.
Hi, BLab Codes.
Shanthi, let's begin with talking about your research journey. What inspired you to conduct research in the area of migration studies and youth mobility?
Oh, great question. So I was probably a bit of a mobile young person myself. And after I finished my undergraduate degree, I went to Berlin on a working holiday. I'd previously spent some time in Germany as an exchange student during my undergraduate degree. Did a lot of travelling around Europe and was a little bit directionless in terms of what I wanted as a career. When I came back to Australia, I ended up in Melbourne, and I'd done an English teaching qualification when I was in Berlin, and that really was just a way to earn money while I was travelling. When I got back to Melbourne, I started teaching academic preparation courses targeted towards international students who wanted to do degree programs at Australian universities. So I would do the kind of 1 to 2 year academic essay writing presentation, either to prepare students for IELTS or sometimes to do a program that could act as an alternative to IELTS. So that was when I started really getting interested in the changes to the university system and the kind of long journeys that these international students were on. Because when I talked to them about what they were doing in Australia as students, it was just so radically different from my exchange experience, where I went for 1 semester and I didn't pay any fees, and it was much more about the experience and the grades, and then I came back. Whereas for a lot of the international students that I was preparing for university, a lot of them were Chinese and Indian, and most of them wanted to get PR, permanent residency in Australia. And that's when I kind of realised, well, there's a real connection here between our universities' processes of internationalisation in this country and our migration system. And this was kind of in the early to mid-2000s when there wasn't a lot of acknowledgement about this policy connection. So I wrote a proposal for my PhD, and I did a PhD around the education migration nexus and the journeys of international students who want to go on to become skilled migrants. And Marina, it's a journey that's very familiar to you personally, right?
Yes.
So that's how I kind of came to migration studies and the migration sociological literature.
Yeah.
And when I was doing my PhD, I didn't really have any idea if I wanted an academic career, but I did end up in one, and that initial interest has sort of led to a trajectory of a number of different research projects that all circulate around that idea of young people being on the move.
Oh no, that's great, and I agree. I'm on that sort of journey myself. So yeah, it's quite challenging at this situation, with the current situation in Australia as well. But
because you are now working on the project on youth mobility, I just want to understand if you can talk a little bit more about how you are framing this research and how you are doing that. Thank you.
So where this research project really comes from is just the idea that at the moment, there's a real mobility imperative for young people, both young people coming to Australia and young people going out of Australia. For this generation of young people, they're facing actually quite a lot of economic and social insecurity, but there's also increasingly a cultural imperative that you have to go and have these global experiences. So especially for young Australians, middle-class young Australians, it's almost become very normal rite of passage to adulthood that you go and do a few years in London or a few years in New York, or you have an expatriate experience, as they call it. Don't like the word expatriate for a number of reasons, in Asia. And it's kind of the idea that you almost can't become a fully actualised cosmopolitan individual unless you spend some time overseas. And there's just a lot of normative assumptions that time spent overseas is somehow good for young people, particularly that it's good for their careers, that you're going to get these global skills and global experiences and you're going to bring those back to career success in your home country. But there isn't actually any research that really gives a full picture of what the impacts of these transnational mobility experiences in your 20s are. I mean, do people just go and have a really great time and a fun experience and come back and there's little to no long-term impact? Or is there a serious and ongoing impact on their life trajectories from that point? And the constellation of researchers that have come together on this project, we're all bringing different interests in, and we're interested really in 3 dimensions of impact and outcomes of transnational mobility for young people. We're interested in outcomes on people's education and career pathways. So in terms of things like your earning capacity, but also in terms of things like, do you make radical changes to your career path because of an overseas experience? Is it easy to reintegrate yourself back into the labour market in your home country if you've been away for several years? But we're also interested in social aspects. So the other dimension is around family and friendship networks, transnational social networks, and how those maybe shape and condition people's mobility. Okay. So, for example, the Australia to London connection, people go there often because of the visa opportunities, but also because their social networks move with them and they travel with groups of friends. So does that change the outcomes of your mobility experience? And I guess we're also interested, as people move towards adulthood, they maybe form relationships, partnerships, marriages, start thinking about having children. How do those decisions come to be inflected with your desires to be on the move? And then the final dimension we're looking at is citizenship. So thinking about that really broadly in terms of your actual political belonging, where you can vote, whether you try to pursue permanent residency and citizenship, but also in terms of that sort of idea of what kinds of issues and causes as a citizen matter to you. Okay. So does your focus shift if you spend time living overseas? Do you think about particular social and political issues more globally? Like, where do your political investments lie, and do those things change as a result of your mobility? So it's quite a big project across these 3 dimensions, but it's really aiming for that holistic understanding of what the impacts of mobility might be on young people's lives.
Great.
Sorry, can I pick a little bit on the thing you were talking about, the transitioning from youth to adulthood?
Yeah.
So what is like your framing of youth? And how does that transit to adulthood?
Great, so that's a really good question, and I guess as we're sociologists and anthropologists working on the project, and we don't think about youth as a biological age necessarily. We think about it as this period of transition. So when people feel like they're transitioning from the life stage of being a bit more dependent on their parents and their family to being an independent adult and kind of making an adult life. And the boundaries of that can be really fuzzy. And there's a particular trend in the sociological literature around this idea of emerging adulthood, and this comes from a scholar called Jeffrey Arnett. And his basic thesis is, particularly in modern contemporary Western societies, the journey from being a dependent young person to being an independent adult has become really stretched. So even a few generations ago, people would usually complete their education and get married fairly quickly after that, and often they would move, particularly women, might move straight from their family home into starting their own household with a husband and children. Whereas now you see this real period of sort of flexibility and exploration, usually across the 20s, sometimes into the early 30s, where people are supposed to be kind of on these journeys of self-discovery, career building, the sort of philosophical and existential stuff of figuring out who you are. So this idea of emerging adulthood kind of sees the process of moving from young person to adult as a fairly open-ended one, and one that involves still some of those maybe like normative social markers of economic independence, forming your own family, buying your own house, but with an understanding that there's a lot of more internal self-development markers that people think about too. And what we're really keeping in mind as well is that in the contemporary context, some of those traditional normative markers of what it means to be an adult, like marriage and home ownership, not only are they a lot harder to achieve nowadays, but not everybody wants to achieve them either. So people have different meanings around what it is to become an adult. And that's something we really want to explore. And I think it gets even more complicated when you're in cross-cultural kind of context too. So in some of my earlier research, a lot of young Asian women, they come to countries like Australia because it gives them the opportunity to diverge a little bit from the traditional life path. They can delay getting married, they can expand on their educational opportunities, they can maybe take part in some social practices and leisure practices that are a bit less acceptable in their home countries and hometowns. So they're kind of remaking across different cultures what it means to become an adult as well. So we're interested not just in the process, but also in what does it really mean? Like, what does becoming adult mean today? And how does that become complicated when people are living in all these different places?
Great. I think this segues really nicely into and you actually did touch upon your previous project as well, Staggered Pathways, which was about long-term temporary migration in Australia very broadly, and all of these different issues that people face in that sort of transition period. Can you tell us a little bit more about the project in general? What does it mean by staggered? How is a pathway staggered? Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
So that particular project is pretty much looking at particular contemporary conditions of migration in Australia that have been shaped by big policy shifts over the last 15 to 20 years. So it used to be the case in the post-war period of mass migration in Australia that most migrants came permanently, settled permanently, either arrived with permanent residency or got permanent residency really soon after arrival. So it was a very linear pathway, and the idea was, well, this is a pathway for people to be quote unquote become Australian and become permanent members of the community. A number of different shifts to policy, shifts to visa regimes have led to a really radically different situation in the 21st century. Now more than 50% of migrants arrive on temporary visas. Lots of migrants transition across different temporary visas. So in terms of my project, I was looking at people that might have arrived on student or working holiday visas in their early 20s and then managed to stay in Australia for 7, 8, 9, 10 years, transitioning across these different temporary visa categories, but not quite being able to achieve permanent residency. So this project was really about how does the kind of uncertainty and the transience of that kind of migration pathway shape people's lives. And people have to sort of negotiate their lives around immigration policy. That was another kind of key element of the project. Often people have to negotiate what they want to do career-wise, their relationships, where they live, in order to try to achieve the goal of migration security. So just a couple of examples of that might be, there are often better visa opportunities if you go to live regionally in Australia. So people who would really much prefer to live in Melbourne and Sydney would go out to a regional area for employer sponsorship in order to get a job that would secure them a visa. Or on the relationship front, because Australia has provision for partner visas, sometimes people would really accelerate their romantic relationships and make decisions about the commitments to their relationships that maybe they wouldn't be making for another 4 or 5 years, but because of the visa situation, it's like, okay, we've got to move in together, we've got to get a joint bank account. It doesn't matter if maybe we're ready or we're not ready, because if we don't do this, my visa will end and then I'll have to leave. So the project was actually focused conceptually around temporality, so how these migration pathways change the way people experience time. So delays to career trajectories might be one example, acceleration of relationships might be another, the creation of these kind of times of exception where people can have a few years of really exploratory and kind of creative time before they maybe go back to their obligations at home. So that's what the project was really about, all of these different kind of circulating issues around the uncertainty of that staggered visa pathway. So the staggered is kind of jumping across the different visas, but the staggered is also moving back and forth between different places and different identities and different stages of life.
Wow, that sounds really fascinating.
Yeah. Okay, so because like I read a lot of your papers and I was kind of curious, gender is something that you don't mention much in these projects or your papers. So I kind of wondered, because earlier you mentioned like at your early stage there are some Indian participants, they may, like females, they use this kind of strategy to delay in a relationship or for marriage. But are there like have you encountered any gendered pattern in your studies that in your previous project or something you are going to look into in your current project?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually writing a little bit more about gender for my book, which is based on the Staggered Pathways project. It probably hasn't come through so much in the papers that are out at the moment. I mean, migration policy is kind of gender blind in a way. So in terms of those, or it's supposed to be gender blind. So in terms of those pressures that come institutionally and from the visa regime, those pressures tend to be the same for men and women. What I'm writing about quite a lot in the book are the intimate relationships, and that's where gender does come in quite significantly, particularly for young people from particular cultures. And that's often because the norms around what a legitimate relationship is for migration purposes in Australia might be different from people's familial norms. So living together, for example, is often a criteria to get a partner visa, but that might not be socially acceptable for both men and women, depending on what their home culture and family's kind of point of view on that is.
Yeah, that's true.
But to go back to the question of gender, one of the things I am writing about in the book chapter is the gender dynamics of who leads the migration. So for example, there are a couple of women in the sample where they were the ones in the partnership that had the skills to be the primary visa holder, and they were very happy for their male partner to be the dependent spouse visa, but sometimes the male partner or the woman's family were not happy about that. So I think there's definitely a gendered stigma around spouse and partner visas.
Okay.
There's a lot of stigma around Asian women who come as spouses because of a whole history in the Asia Pacific around marriage migration. And even in people's home countries, the idea of a foreign bride, for example, in somewhere like Taiwan, it has a lot of social stigma and class stigma attached to it because it's about rural women who are using migration for kind of economic stability. So a lot of middle class young people in Australia feel very uncomfortable about applying for these partner visas. They worry, for example, that their partner's family will think that they're using them, that they're being instrumental, that the relationship isn't real or genuine even though it is. So they worry about those kinds of stigmas. And they worry as well, you know, some women who were being sponsored by male partners but feel like it's kind of struggle with the idea of wanting to feel like I'm an independent woman, I'm a feminist, am I compromising myself if I stay in Australia dependent on staying here on a partner? So in the work that I've already done, nearly all of the young people, the partner visa was the last resort. So they would try all of the other ways to independently migrate, and often the partner visa would be the very, very last thing. So we really have to do this, else we're going to be separated, and so we'll do the partner visa. But it was very rarely the first choice or the initial decision. I think because of all these gendered stigmas that kind of circulate around it.
But it's also like whether they're negotiating within that sort of personal relationship, one-on-one with each other, and having to go through all of that sort of social stigma around it, or gendered stigma around it. But then the other thing is also the system, the migration system around partner visas, or how difficult is it to apply for one? Like, what are some of the regulatory, like, are they going through a lot of regulatory stuff in order to actually get this approved? The kind of paperwork that's required to establish a genuine relationship, those kinds of things, is that factoring into this as well? Or?
Look, I mean, the tendency tends to be that compared to some of the other visa pathways, like compared to, say, employer sponsorship or independent skilled migration, the partner visas are often easier in some ways, but it is quite a difficult process because you have to provide all of this evidence, and most people who are in genuine relationships have this evidence, but it's making your intimate life visible to a migration regime basically, and having to sit down with your partner, and you might be young and it might be your first real adult relationship, and you have to kind of make your relationship and your relationship practices, the financial ones, the cohabitation ones, you have to make them fit immigration criteria. So I mean, joint bank accounts is a really, really good example. There are many couples that are together for many, many years and just prefer not to amalgamate their finances, right? Like my partner and I didn't do it for a very long time. We didn't have to. And we were living in Melbourne when we finally decided, okay, we're going to get a joint bank account, and we went into the Commonwealth Bank and said we want to apply for a joint bank account. And the first thing that the staff asked me was, well, how long have you been in the country? And we looked at each other like, oh, because I was born in Australia. But obviously most, mixed ethnic couples that come in, they're getting the joint bank account because one of them's on a temporary visa and they're looking to apply for a partner visa. So you have to sort of, you can't be completely autonomous in the way you structure your relationship, right? You have to structure it in such a way that it meets the criteria of the immigration regime.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah.
And so in some ways, for both men and women, it can take away a little bit of independence around how you structure your relationship. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well,
yeah, so there's a lot of interesting things you were talking about beyond the papers I read that was, quite, hard to describe the feelings about as a migrant over here and to negotiate with all the migration infrastructure over here. Yeah, I kind of want to know whether there are like broad implications or impacts out of your research studies. I mean, personally, I feel a lot through your works.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's that really drives my commitment to this work, is that nearly every time I present or talk about this work, there will be at least one or two people in the audience that come up and say, we were talking about my life. Yeah. You know, these are the things that have happened to me. And I mean, Marina, you're my student all the time. Your life experiences, which are really sometimes incredibly difficult, are reflected in the data that I collect. So for me, actually telling those stories is powerful and is enough. Because if you don't know somebody that's gone through that, you actually have no idea. And I think maybe it's getting a little bit better now, but when I embarked on this research agenda, like most Australian citizens or even previous generations of settler migrants have absolutely zero understanding of what has to go into these staggered migration pathways. The amount of money, the amount of time, the amount of psychological and emotional investment. So for me, letting people know that this is a lived reality for many of our friends and colleagues in Australia is important, and it is an important thing to just tell the stories. In terms of policy implications, I used to be quite active in advocating towards federal policy. I don't know if that is a particularly productive way to go, especially with our current government, because I think regardless of the research evidence, I don't see a lot of policy change there. I think one other thing I really aim for with the research is to enable kind of localised networks of solidarity and to make sure that people have the support and information that they need as they go through these pathways.
Yeah.
I think particularly for international students as a group, we've seen really great strides there over the past 15 to 20 years. When I started doing research on international students, their well-being and many of the issues of exploitation that they faced were just really not dealt with by any level of government. Like, their welfare was just seen to be the concern of the educational institutions. Whereas now, I think municipal government, state government, federal government, they have much more of a stake in understanding there are particular issues that students face, that they're not just students, they're also workers. And so I think there's been a lot of strides there in terms of just a better understanding and generation of kind of more engagement. So I hope that'll start to happen for certain kinds of, other kinds of temporary migrants as well. With the Youth Mobilities project, I think a potential impact of this is also kind of a public engagement and public education aim, just to kind of inform educational institutions, young people and their families that yes, of course, it's a fantastic opportunity to go overseas. It can be such a great, enriching experience. But before you undertake that experience, let's stop and think about what some of the implications will be. You know, because I think, are you going to go into debt in order to achieve this? What will be the implications for your tax, for your superannuation? I think students from upper middle class, well-resourced families, they don't have any problems with this stuff. But as the imperative to be mobile starts going across all of society, and, you know, working class students and students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are also feeling like, well, for a well-rounded CV, I have to go and do this overseas experience. Giving them the opportunity and the resources to actually be able to think through some of the pros and cons of it and the best way to do it so that the outcomes and the impacts are actually positive for them. I think that's really important. And I think it's particularly important because there's a whole industry as well that underpins these mobilities. So, you know, there are these internship providers that say, we'll pay $5,000 and we'll get you this placement, or we'll get you this volunteer experience and we'll facilitate everything. And I would like young people to have the tools themselves to engage with that industry critically, and to think through, to not have to rely on commercial brokers to have those experiences, and to think about what some of the pros and cons might be.
Okay. No, that's great. I wanted to this is quite enough, I think, in Australia. I just want to talk about sort of what's happening within the field of migration studies. Is migration studies, it's beginning to get a lot of focus within the Australian context. And I just want to know, what's the future, or what do you think, what are your comments on this area of research, or this field of, it's quite broad. There's so much happening inside this broad area, but what are your thoughts on this field of study?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big change for Australian migration studies is that traditionally, from the post-war era onwards, particularly migration sociologists, they were really focused on a couple of things. They were focused on the idea of the ethnic community. Yeah. So what's happening in the Chinese community and what's happening in the Indian community, and let's research the way these communities do things and the way that they live so we can better understand them, which is a very valid aim. And the other thing they really focused on was settlement. So what are positive settlement outcomes? How do people become at home in Australia? How do we enable belonging? How do we enable inclusion? How do we make sure that for the second generation of migrants, they're well included in Australian society? And all of those things are really important. But I think now we have to kind of move to kind of more complicated understandings of what migration means, because it doesn't mean a one-way linear pathway to settlement. It doesn't mean people who are going to stay forever. But it does mean people that even if they don't stay put forever, they often still have ongoing relationships to Australia, and they might circulate back and forth, and they might have different kinds of more dispersed and more transnational relationships. So I think we have to think beyond settlement as like a linear pathway, and also to understand that because of the fragmentation of visa categories, not everybody has access to the same resources to enable their settlement. So that's really important to think about as well. And I think we need to get beyond thinking about the ethnic community in a really singular way. Like Yinghua has, you know, with your research.
Yes.
It's kind of nonsensical to talk about the Chinese community of Sydney.
That's true.
Because it's so diverse. The experiences of someone like you as a more recent migrant and coming from mainland China is completely different from previous generations, you know, even from someone who maybe came 15 years ago.
Yeah.
That's true.
So there's generational differences, linguistic differences. So to have like a single ethnic category and think that we can say something about experience just under that ethnic category,
Yeah.
I think we're starting to move forward from that as a scholarly field. I think we really need to focus on that. And so I really am quite excited by studies like both of your studies, because Yinghua, you're interested in Chinese women, but a very specific subset of them and a very contemporary experience.
That's true.
So you're not making any generalizable claims that all Chinese women have these experiences. And Marina, you're not defining your sample by an ethnic background or a nationality. You're defining it through a particular kind of migration pathway and a particular engagement with migration infrastructure. So really, I would say the kinds of methodological and conceptual approaches that both of you are taking, that's the future of migration studies in Australia. You are the next generation, and you are thinking beyond these conventional settlement ethnic community dynamics. So we're heading in the right direction.
Yay.
Yeah.
That's good to know. It's awesome.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. I just one last thing. So Shanthi, I know your current project is going to open for recruitment for participants, right? Is there
Yes,
something
yeah.
you want to say and share before we end our conversation
Please,
today?
that would be fantastic. So we are looking for young people aged between 18 to 30. We're looking for both young Australian people who are going to travel or who have already gone overseas for 6 months or more. And we're also looking for non-Australian young people who are coming into Australia for 6 months or more. So if you've just arrived in Australia, or if you've been here for a year or two, or if you're planning your overseas experience at the moment, or if you're heading off to the UK or wherever you're going, you can be part of this project. It's a really exciting 5-year project. And it's pretty minimal participation for most people because it's just completing a survey, 3 surveys over 4 years. We will have a smaller sample that we'll be interviewing as well. So we would really love to have participants. We're also looking at 4 ancestry backgrounds. So if your family background, ethnicity, nationality, anything falls broadly into the categories of Chinese, Indian, UK or Italian, we're really interested to hear your stories. And the best way to register your interest for participation in the project is to look at the project website, which is www.ymapproject.org. So it's YMAP. But if you Google YMAP project, YMAP, we should come up like 2nd or 3rd hit, I think. And we also have a Twitter account where you can follow us too. Or you can always just look me up on the Western Sydney website and shoot me an email too, and I'll direct you to the website.
Or you can ask us, and we will point you in the right direction as well. We'll probably try and provide more information through our platform as well then.
That'd be fantastic. You know, it's so important for us as social researchers that everything that we do can only exist because of all of the fantastic people out there who agree to participate and share their stories. So if you're interested, please register. We'd love to hear from you.
That's great. Congratulations, Shanthi, on your awesome work and this amazing projects. And thank you so much for coming up and giving us your time. Thank you. And I think
give us our encouragement
and
going
encouraging
forward.
us for the future of migration studies. This is amazing. So thanks so much. And this was great.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.